Some of the greatest fighters in UFC history come to mind when you think about some of the most famous rivals, including Georges St. Pierre, John Jones, BJ Penn, Daniel Cormier, and a long list of others. Nate Diaz is one person who recently put his name permanently on this list. He is without a doubt one of the greatest stars in UFC history, even though he may not have achieved the peak and won a championship. Love him or dislike him, Nate Diaz is one of the biggest names on the UFC lineup at the moment. Guys, let's ask ourselves this question. Do you think Nate Diaz will achieve his goal with his fighting skills? Or maybe he fights for just passion? Who knows? Well, I don't want to jump to a conclusion. But with this heads up, keep watching to see the 5 most memorable finishes of Nate Diaz in UFC history. If you are new here, you are on the right channel. But before we get to the biggest moments of Nate Diaz, let's take a brief talk on his humble beginnings. Nate Diaz was born on April 16, 1985, and is presently 37 years old. He was born in Stockton, California, in the United States. Melissa and Robert Diaz are his parents' names. He spent most of his youth with his brothers Nick and sister Nina. He was fascinated by martial arts from his infancy and began learning about them when he was 11 years old. He practiced with his brother Nick. He spent most of his time training in martial arts. Nate fell in love with the sport, and since that moment, every other thing is history. Now, here is the interesting part. In ranking order, let's take a look at Nate Diaz's 5 most memorable finishes in UFC history. Number 5. Nate Diaz vs. Kurt Pellegrino at UFC Fight Night 13. Nate Diaz received a UFC deal after a blazing performance on The Ultimate Fighter in 2007. He extended his strong form into his UFC debut, as he won his first 2 fights very handily through first-round submissions. However, he faced tremendous troubles against Kurt Pellegrino in his 3rd UFC fight. Nevertheless, Diaz showcased his patented durability against a bigger opponent and added to his tally of submission wins as well. Nate Diaz appeared completely outmatched against Kurt Pellegrino, who was stronger than the TUF champion after being crushed for the first round and a half. In the 2nd round, Pellegrino grabbed Diaz up over his head and slammed him down to the ground to demonstrate his control over him. When the Stockton native landed on the ground, he locked Kurt in a triangle choking move and snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, famously flexing and putting up the double middle fingers. Wow, Nate is good in submissions. I feel all his fights will be won by submission. But let's see the next memorable finishes by Nate Diaz. Number 4. Nate Diaz vs. Takanorigami, UFC 135. Back in 2007, when Nate Diaz had just broken into the scene on The Ultimate Fighter, his brother Nick competed in Pride 33 against Takanorigami, regarded as the best lightweight in the world at the time. The older Diaz brother produced one of the most memorable submission wins in MMA history on the night by finishing the Japanese star. 4 years after Nick Diaz vs. Takanorigami battles under the Pride promotional banner, Gami signed with the UFC and faced his old opponent's younger brother, Nate, in his 3rd fight inside the cage. Nate Diaz was relatively early in his UFC career at the time, and he was primarily in the shadow of his brother. The TUF winner faced Gami at UFC 135, and the fight was scarcely contested, with Diaz dominating from start to finish. The Stockton native's clean boxing was on spot straight away, and Gami had no answers on the feet. As a result, the Japanese legend rushed to take down Nate, but as wise as Nate is, he hooked him onto an armbar and forced him to tap out. Now, check out the fight at the Ultimate Fighter Finale 18. Number 3. Nate Diaz vs. Gray Maynard. Nate Diaz's 3-fight rivalry with Gray Maynard began in 2007, when both young lightweights competed on the Ultimate Fighter Season 5. Diaz and Maynard competed in the reality series semifinals to earn a spot in the finals. Diaz prevailed that time, winning by submission. 3 years later, they met in a UFC Fight Night main event in Fairfax, Virginia, where Maynard won a close split decision. Many people still feel Diaz deserved to win the night's competition, but they never escaped a rematch. The pair squared up for the 3rd fight in 2013. Diaz came out like a house on fire in the 1st round, looking spectacular from the start. In the opening 2 minutes, he lit Maynard with some quick boxing combinations, and once he established his range, the fight was kind of over. Diaz unleashed a torrent of blows halfway through the opening round after forcing Maynard towards the fence. Maynard suffered repeated severe punches as a result of his continuous attack, causing the referee to intervene. Number 2. Nate Diaz vs. Tony Ferguson, 279. Nate Diaz was anxious to fight out his last UFC contract and explore the chances of free agency, having just one fight left on his deal following his 5-rounder with Leon Edwards in 2021. He was handed a huge mismatch in his last UFC fight against the unbeaten and highly hyped Khamzat Chimaev at UFC 279, as is common in the fight promotion industry. The UFC's intentions were clear with this booking, and MMA fans braced themselves for a possibly brutal farewell to the great. Diaz was a significant opponent coming into the fight, and many defended the pairing, claiming disrespect and hatred as reasons why the UFC would put him up against such an unappealing opponent. Nate Diaz was partnered with fellow UFC veteran Tony Ferguson following Khamzat Chimaev's severe weight loss and consequent rescheduling of the fight event. Diaz and Ferguson are two of the most popular fighters in the UFC, and given that they are about the same age, the decision was well accepted by fans. Diaz went from being a tough opponent to a slight betting top choice of fans with a new opponent. The fight was very equal, with Diaz succeeding with his punches and Ferguson creating severe damage with his kicks. Diaz was on shaky knees going into the last round, and Ferguson was showing it on his face. Ferguson looked to be slowing down as well, which was not surprising given that he was prepared for a 3-round battle until the card was changed at the last minute. Diaz jumped on a grip choke after Ferguson tried a way to take down Nate, forcing the tap of the 4th round in the most beautiful way known. Everything about this victory, from the submission to the timing of the finish, was ideal for Diaz's 15-year UFC career. Now to the last number. I believe we have been anticipating this fight. Well, it came, but what did Nate Diaz use in winning? Is it submission or by KO? Now let's see it. Number 1. Nate Diaz vs. Conor McGregor, UFC 196. Nate Diaz has always been a fan favorite among MMA fans. However, his fame grew during his first encounter with Conor McGregor, which not only improved his value, but also witnessed the rise of the UFC and MMA in popular sports on a worldwide scale. Back in 2016, when McGregor was part of the sport's greatest star, many assumed the Irishman would destroy any opponent put in front of him. After winning undisputed featherweight gold, the Notorious chose to go up to 155 pounds and became the first ever 2-division champion. He was scheduled to face then lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos at UFC 196, but the 155-pound champion suffered a foot injury, forcing the UFC to hunt for a substitute. After considering so many choices, the organization decided on Nate Diaz as McGregor's next opponent, since the Stockton native was the only one prepared to take the fight on such short notice. Diaz was a huge betting favorite heading into the competition, and the opening round revealed why. In the first 5 minutes, McGregor looked near perfect, catching his American opponent many times with his renowned strong left straight. Diaz's toughness, on the other hand, shined through in the second frame. Despite hitting his best blows flush, McGregor was unable to finish his opponent, and the frustration seemed to have impaired his gas tank and decision-making. Out of pure wariness, the Irish superstar was caught with a pinpoint Diaz 1-2 to the chin, forcing him to shoot for a takedown. Diaz cut through McGregor's guard like a hot knife, and he quickly established a backside choke, becoming the first fighter in UFC history to beat the so-called The Notorious. Nate Diaz emerged as a genuine superstar after defeating Conor McGregor. It not only earned the Stockton native a handsome salary, but also set the tone for the remainder of his career. Guys, what do you think about his most memorable finishes? Let us know in the comment section down below.